Last week, in celebration of Easter and Passover, we shared some biblical stories. Among them, the very first story of the very first book of Hebrew Scripture. This account of God creating the heavens and the earth and all living creatures is a story that many of us, more scientific folks, might wish to avoid. It has been used to refute the Big Bang, evolution, archaeological evidence, and other more science-based understandings of the world. And so why would we, good, rational, scientific-minded people that we are, why would we tell that story over and over again? I think that for many of us, we continue to act from the assumptions that get imprinted on us from the earliest stories, experiences, and relationships of our lives. And I think that part of being the best human beings that we can be is about testing those assumptions in different ways and at different times in our lives. Essentially, that's what therapy is for many of us. Having someone, a therapist, to reflect back to us the assumptions that we have that we might not even know we have, but that keep getting in the way of our emotional health and our relationships. So in case you haven't noticed, I have a little bias that it's good for us to mind the stories with which we grew up. And I know that many of us, probably most of us, if not all of us, grew up with this foundational story from the book of Genesis. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. When I entered seminary, I was so excited that I would get to learn ancient Hebrew and ancient Greek. I imagined that I would finally get past all of the inconsistencies in these different English translations and read the Old and New Testaments in their most original form and suddenly know the Bible's true meaning. But the first disappointment I encountered was in learning that this ancient Hebrew scripture was written centuries before the development of punctuation. There are no commas, no periods, no quotation marks, no capital letters. And here's a great example of why punctuation is so incredibly important. Indeed, there is a big difference between "let's eat, comma, Grandpa," or "hey, let's eat, Grandpa." As it says, commas can save lives. This absence of punctuation meant that in ancient Hebrew, there were no vowel points. Vowel points are used near a letter, sometimes just little dots, to indicate which vowel is being used there, or how different consonants are functioning in the word. And without the vowel points in those early editions, it's sometimes unclear how that word is being used, or even which word is being employed in that moment. So learning ancient Hebrew only made me realize how much we don't know about that ancient text. And I say all that to say that in this story where God made light and dark, water and land, fish and plants and animals and people, there is a line in that story that has become an entire worldview. Even for people who aren't Jewish or Christian, or aren't anymore Jewish or Christian. And I think it's worth noticing what exactly happened according to that text on that fated sixth day. So here's the text from the first chapter of Genesis, beginning with verse 26. And then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image, and in the image of God, he created them. Male and female, God created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." And then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds in the sky and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. This idea of humans ruling over or having dominion over is a translation from a Hebrew root word, radad, which is a flattening down or submitting totally. And depending on how the vowel points got written down, centuries after the earliest versions of this unpunctuated text, determines whether we are talking about people who flatten down or have dominion over the earth, or people submitting to or bowing down before the earth. So you're either trampling it down or you're submitting yourself to it. Kind of a big difference, right? Biblical scholars debate which word the earliest writers of this text meant. And the difference is in the word is literally the difference between one vowel point or two, which discerns whether the word is radah, dominion over, or yirad, bowing to. And you wouldn't have to know a thing about this text to know that as descendants of this tradition, we have been taught to believe that there is a hierarchy. And human beings are at the top, and everything else is beneath us. And this word radah that became the prevailing interpretation of this text is not just power over, but it is a violent, coercive, harmful power over. In this word is a power that assumes that our needs as people come before anything else at any cost. Radah, dominion over, is our over-industrialization despite how it drives climate change. Radah is monocropping because it serves us instead of honoring the land's inherent need for diversity. Radah is mountaintop removal, deforestation, excessive travel, an entitlement to disposable bags, containers, and other goods that end up in our rivers, oceans, and wildlife. Radah is caring more about managing and decorating our houses than we do about the global environment or the quality of our air or the landfills. Radah, dominion over, is owning houses that are bigger than we need, buying new devices every year, using herbicides and pesticides so that our native, non-native gardens can look perfect and exotic, instead of going with the natural order of our region's plants, insects, and wildlife. Radah is a habit of buying next-day delivery or constantly shipping in goods that we can get locally. And I know this is really unpopular for me to say this, but this radah, this dominion over, is consuming foods when we have the economic privilege to choose that are a burden on the environment. That is food that has been shipped a long way or required an intense amount of resources to develop or that have resulted in the suffering of animals. There is no question that the majority of our country believes that humanity exists in dominion over the rest of creation, to use our power to subdue the land and other created life. But what if? What if we are meant to bow down to creation? What if the word is Yarad, to bow down, to lower oneself to all of creation? What if Chad Tolman is right in his poem on science and we, people, have all this power to use for good or to use for evil? And really what we're meant to do is use that power to make the world a better place as a whole. A part of this story that's indisputable is that people are special. The writer bothers to break one sentence down into verse. So going from the prose of the rest of the story to poetry for just one line. This one line, verse 27, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. The writer wants you to really slow down on that one sentence. It's as if to say there is nothing more important in all of creation than that sixth day, that moment when God created people in God's own image. Now, of course, people wrote that, right? I mean, this isn't a cow writing that humans are the best ever. It's humans writing that humans are the best ever. But not just humans. Humans wrote this text with centuries of experience with humanity. The first people who shared this story knew that people mess up. People are power hungry, cheating, lying, self-interested, and they were using this story to call us back to our better selves, our higher purpose, our greater way of being in life. The tellers of this story were saying, you are made in the image of something so holy that holiness itself stepped back and said, it is good. Which, again, good is a horrible word that gets translated in other contexts as excellent or beautiful. Wow, that is excellent, beautiful. You are beautiful. This story is not in competition with science. This story is all about science based on what people knew then. Chad Tolman writes, science is creativity, doing new things, putting things together in entirely new ways. Science is awe and wonder at the beauty, diversity, and complexity of this world. Here we are approaching the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, and the most impossible thing has happened. The earth is resting from our dominion over it. While people around the world are staying at home, air pollution levels have plummeted. Satellite images have revealed a clear drop in global levels of nitrogen dioxide, a gas which is primarily emitted from car engines and commercial manufacturing plants and is responsible for the poor air quality in most of our major cities. For the first time in 30 years, people in northern India are reporting seeing the Himalayas from where they live. The reduction in pollution is a huge gain for fighting climate change, but it's also an opportunity for us to better survive COVID-19. Studies show that even just this sudden shift to cleaner air can reduce the severity of symptoms related to the virus. I mean, it makes sense, right? When your breathing is diminished by the virus, the last thing you need is another factor like pollution, making it hard to breathe. Less pollution means greater chances of surviving COVID-19, and it means less strain on our hospitals. A National Geographic article stated cleaner pandemic skies should also reduce other pressures on hospitals struggling with COVID-19 cases. A large body of evidence shows that short-term changes in air quality have an immediate impact on the number of heart attacks, strokes, and emergency room visits. But as soon as that pollution goes back up, we get more heart attacks, more strokes, more emergency room visits. Animals are also getting a break this Earth Day. In Brazil, environmentalists report a surge of newly hatched baby sea turtles making their way to the ocean, suddenly unencumbered by people and our pets who typically crowd the beaches and keep them out of the ocean. I've heard too reports of animals coming out of hiding into major cities. A coyote was photographed roaming the streets of San Francisco. Wild boar are in the streets of Barcelona. There are mountain goats hanging out in a town in Wales. In Mediterranean shipping lanes, there are suddenly whales swimming. And with the closure of national parks, wildlife can finally freely roam about the land. A ranger at Yosemite National Park said of the bears there, quote, "For the most part, I think they're having a party. I think that this time of year is difficult for the animals here. There can literally be walls of cars, stop and go traffic, or people in the park." She said the bears usually find corridors to get from one end of the valley to the other to avoid humans, but since the park closure, she said rangers noticed there are more bears walking through the meadow. For the last decade, the Hong Kong Zoo has been unsuccessfully trying to get a pair of panda bears to mate, and now that steady streams of people are not moving by their enclosure, they're finally relaxed enough to succeed. And all of this makes me think about a question that someone posted on Facebook a few weeks ago. After this whole pandemic thing is over, what do you hope doesn't go back to normal? Once this pandemic is over, what do you hope does not go back to normal? I mean, don't get me wrong. I know this is a hard time. I get that our economy is suffering. Individuals and corporations and small businesses are in dire financial hardship. People are sick. People are overworked. There is an imbalance that is happening right now, and there is tremendous suffering, and I wish that weren't so. And for a long, long time, people have been saying, we cannot fix these global environmental challenges. But I think that human beings were created with a kind of ingenuity and heart for this work. We can solve dynamic, complex problems, and I believe that we can fix the problems that we are facing as a world. But more than that, I believe that we are created to do this work, to bow down to all of creation, to erase this long-held notion that humanity is at the top and everything else is ours to do with as we choose. Instead, we must reimagine our worldview. What could a new worldview look like? Not one that leads us not to trample over the earth and creation, but one that inspires us to offer reverence to the earth and to creation. Sally McFague was a Christian theologian who died last year, and her work was around theological metaphors, and she invited people to imagine God not as a person, not as a spirit, but to imagine God as the world or cosmos itself. What if the world is God? And all that is good and holy and right is earth itself and all that lives and breathes on earth and in the surrounding atmosphere. And we were created to help care for it and stay in right relationship with it and to be that holiness itself. Nothing is separate then from one another. Nothing is separate from God. God is all of us. How then would we interact with our land? With water, with birds and fish, with animals, with one another? These are the kinds of questions that I think this pandemic is asking of us. What would it look like to restore balance to our world? For those of us who never imagined we could fly less or drive less, how, after weeks of staying at home, could we imagine that differently? For those of us who never imagined that we could reduce our burning of fossil fuels, how can we begin to imagine investing in clean air, clean energy, clean transportation? And during this world health crisis, many of us are in new ways learning to listen to and empathize with the needs of people we didn't imagine needs for before. People in service industry, healthcare industry, small business owners, nature itself. We're learning to listen. So many people are growing gardens and food in new ways, watching nature unfold in our backyards and in our windowsills. We're not going to get through this pandemic with a framework of hierarchy. We're not going to get through this pandemic with a hierarchy that places one country's needs above another. We're not going to get through this pandemic with a framework where rich people are more important than poor people, or where young people are more important than older people, or that the lives and well-being of white people are more important than the lives and well-being of black people. We won't get through this with a hierarchy that says that the needs and lives of free people is more important than the needs and lives of incarcerated people. We will not get through this pandemic even with a framework that says that the interests of people come above the interests of our world as a whole. These are the destructive models we have been operating on in this country for way too long, and at the expense of the health and well-being of ourselves, one another, and our earth. We were created in the image of something good that we might proliferate, not proliferating human beings, but proliferating that goodness and beauty and awe that is inherent in everything. Water, land, stars, sun, moon, bugs, plants, animals. In the midst of pandemic, and whenever it is time for us to leave our homes safely, may we live as if that were so.